the Krebs cycle intermediates. These are if you think of life as being carbon-based, it's made of carbon and oxygen and hydrogen mostly, then there's nitrogen, there's sulfur and all kinds of other, the phosphate, there's all kinds of other things there as well. But the basic hand of cards for carbon-based life is the Krebs cycle intermediates, these molecules, these carbon-based molecules. And from them, we make the amino acids that make proteins. We make the sugars that we make up partly nucleotides, the building blocks of DNA and RNA and the genetic code. And from there as well, we make the lipids, which are used for the membranes themselves. So this is the kind of the spinning heart of all of life, making the building blocks for life. And it's doing it from hydrogen and CO2. And to make them react, you need a charge on the membrane. That charge on the membrane, I won't go into the details now, but it's also actually coming from the reaction between hydrogen and CO2. You need a lot of hydrogen, you need a lot of CO2, and you're doing everything with that. It's actually being called a free lunch that you'll pay to eat hydrogen and CO2. It's a very good way of making a living. And then genetic information. So I'm going to talk about all of these in turn, but the genetic information, where does meaning come from? Where does information come from? This is one of the biggest challenges and questions in all of biology. But there are some patterns in the code that I'll tell you about at the end of the talk, which suggest that there are direct biophysical interactions between amino acids, and I'm showing them here as kind of little blue or red lozenges, and the bases in DNA, the letters in DNA or RNA. There are direct interactions that just happen because of how much they like or dislike water, their hydrophobicity or their size and things like that. And if you have a random sequence of RNA, and onto that you effectively stick a non-random set of amino acids that are stuck there because of the biophysical interactions, that they're not random, then what you've got is a random sequence of RNA templates, a non-random peptide, which can do a job like catalysis. And if that is inside some kind of protocell, then there's no problem with the origin of information in biology. So conceptually, it's not necessarily difficult. Whether any of that's true or not, I'll let you judge at the end of the lecture. So, before I get going on those three things of energy and metabolism and information, I just want to give a sense of where I'm talking about. This setting of fire, air, earth, and water that I think, well, anybody thinks really gives rise to life. We have no idea where. I'm going to give you my own favored scenario, which may or may not be right, but I will try and present an argument for it. And it's down at the bottom of the ocean in these deep sea hydrothermal vents, where we in fact do have air as well, air in the sense of gases. We're not necessarily dealing with the atmosphere, but we're dealing with bubbles that we were hearing about from Kim yesterday, and air-water interface and so on. So a lot of this can also happen down in the oceans too. Why do I want to be down at the bottom of the oceans? Why do I want to go down there? It's from the tree of life itself. This is a tree, a conceptual tree of life done by a towering figure in genetics called Bill Martin, 20 years ago now. And this tree, if you see the top, it says eukaryotes. We're all eukaryotes. So eukaryotes, the word eukaryote means true nucleus. So we've got a nucleus where we put all our DNA, so you could think of it as a kind of information storage dump that we put all the information in the nucleus. And then there's lots of other things inside our own types of cell. I said they're 15,000 times larger on average than bacteria. What you see in this tree, though, is that they're all at the top. They're formed by a kind of a merger. Two of these branches come together, one from a group called the archaea and the other the bacteria. The archaea look exactly like bacteria. You can see them down at the bottom there. They look exactly the same. They're very different in their genetics. They're very different in their biochemistry, but in their morphology, they're very similar. What that means is eukaryotes don't matter. If we want to study the origin of life, they're a derived domain. They're not relevant to the origin of life. We need to take ourselves out of the equation and think only about bacteria and archaea. Then we can look to see what did the common ancestor of the bacteria and the archaea look like. And the answer is, well, it was probably an autotrophic kind of cell, which is to say, a bit like a plant cell, but it didn't need sunlight. It was growing from hydrogen and carbon dioxide, the kind of gases that we find in the vents that I'm talking about. And all the cells down at the bottom of the base of the tree are growing in that kind of way. LUCA, you see right down there, the last universal common ancestor of all of life, very difficult thing to reconstruct. Bill Martin has drawn living inside a hydrothermal vent with two separate emergences of the bacteria and the archaea, which reflects how different they are to each other. And he thought, and I agree with him, that the common ancestor actually lived within the rocks, within these vents themselves. Well, when that paper was written, those vents, those specific vents that he and I and other people now work on, had not yet been discovered. They were discovered a year later by Deb Kelly, who was captain of the Alvin submersible. And she had taken it, she was actually going to the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, where the black smoke events are, and most people are familiar with black smokers. These are effectively underwater volcanoes that Steve was talking about a little bit a few days ago. But these are a different kind of vents. They're not on the ridge itself. They're off, maybe 15 miles away. And they're not smoking in the same way. Sometimes they're called white smokers, but sometimes they don't really smoke at all. There's a completely different process. And you can see that she's holding there, in her right hand, she's holding a piece of lost city. And it looks like a lump of mineralized sponge, almost. And in her left hand, she's holding a piece of a black smoker. This really is a vent with a chimney in it. You can see the chimney, and these are the ones where the black smoke is coming belching out. So these were discovered in the year 2000, relatively recently, this lost city. And they're formed by direct interactions between rock and water. So it's not a result of magma directly, it's not volcanic. Water will percolate down beneath the seafloor for distances of maybe 5 or 6 kilometers, sink down. And when we're close to the spreading centers, when we're close to the ridges, the mantle is thin, the crust is thinner and the mantle is closer to the surface than it is anywhere else today. And the mantle is rich in minerals like olivine, which is colored green here. And olivine and water will react together. There's ferrous iron, non-oxidized iron, if you like, in the olivine, and it's oxidized by the water to rust, more or less. And that gives off hydrogen gas in large amounts and alkaline fluids. When I say alkaline, it's about pH 11 very often. So this is like caustic soda bubbling with hydrogen gas, pretty reactive stuff. And this is warm, it's an exothermic reaction, so these are buoyant fluids that bubble back up to the base of the ocean. And when they arrive in the ocean, the chemistry of the ocean water is quite different to the chemistry of these hydrothermal fluids, and so they react together and precipitate out these vents. So the vents themselves are formed by the reaction between the ocean waters and the hydrothermal fluids. If we go back 4 billion years, the hydrothermal fluids we think should have been basically the same as they are today. Olivine was still the dominant mineral. But the oceans themselves, there was no oxygen then. And there was a lot more iron and heavy metals in the ocean. They were coming out of the black smokers straight into the ocean and precipitated later on in great banded iron formations and things like that. So we know there was a lot of metal there in the early oceans. And so the chemistry of these vents early on would have been quite different to today. Just to emphasize, this is a planetary scale. So when we have plate tectonics and subduction of the crust underneath the ocean, the submarine crust, it's effectively serpentinization hydrates those rocks. It's binding water into them as hydroxides. And when they're subducted down, the heat and the pressure as we go down into the mantle is driving off the water again. It's dehydrating those rocks. And the presence of water within the mantle is driving convection and melting the mantle and increasing the likelihood that you are going to have volcanoes in that region. And when we have volcanoes and spreading and so on, that is in itself driving plate tectonics on a planetary scale. And if we think about, well, what happens, the water is being driven off by high pressures and high temperatures as we go down. But what about a smaller world like Mars? There's some evidence that there was plate tectonics on Mars 4 billion years ago, and there's evidence, quite strong evidence, that there were oceans on Mars 4 billion years ago that have been lost, partly into space. But really, all of that water? Well, it may be partly that because it's smaller, it cooled down faster, and so less of the hydrated rock, less of the water was driven off again. So Mars may have partly buried its oceans as hydrated rock, and that's why we might now think of it as a dead planet. If there's any life on Mars, it's trace amounts of life probably buried somewhere down. There may have been life on Mars. It would be fantastic if we find it now, but it's certainly not a living planet in the way that the Earth is. These kind of processes happen on other places within our own solar system. This is Enceladus, one of the icy moons of Saturn. And there are plumes. The Cassini flyby found these plumes, which you can see there, jetting about 200 kilometers out into space. And using spectroscopy and other methods, they were able to show that they're rich in hydrogen gas, they're alkaline, around about pH 9, and there's reduced carbon molecules like methane and some other organic molecules in there. Almost certainly this is the same process of serpentinization that's going on Enceladus, and possibly as well on Europa, one of the moons of Jupiter. So these are processes that can happen on any wet, rocky planet or moon. And there are potentially tens of billions of them in the Milky Way alone. One thing I'd like to say, I've talked about the structure of cells briefly, and the structure of the planet and the structure of a cell in a loose way. This is not a very direct comparison, but they share a kind of topology, that the Earth inside, with all that iron in there, that iron is rich in electrons, you might say, and when it's oxidized, it's passing those electrons onto oxygen or something else. So the center of the Earth is effectively electron-rich. And the outside, the oceans, the atmosphere, and so on, are relatively oxidized. And so we have a relative charge where it's relatively negative inside, relatively positive outside, relatively acidic outside, and in comparison, alkaline inside. This is very rough. But that's exactly the topology that cells have. What I'm showing on the right-hand side with the bacterial cell, these are the pumps in the membrane that are pumping protons out, making it acidic outside and alkaline inside. And the equivalent that I'm showing for the Earth, well, these are the hydrothermal vents, so it's a little bit different in this case, but in effect, this is the mixing zone. This is where the inside of the Earth is meeting the outside of the Earth. Both of them, in fact, are giant batteries. The Earth is a giant battery, and the cell also functions like a battery. And this is where the mixing is happening, inside these vents. They were predicted 10 years before they were discovered by Mike Russell. And this is a picture of him that was done by Nature in one of the top science journals in 2009, if I remember rightly. So his ideas had gone from being not very mainstream, let's say. A lot of science can be cruel, and I've read some conference proceedings of Mike Russell putting these ideas to people in the 1990s and then being roundly rejected until the discovery of the vent systems that he was talking about and had been predicting. And then suddenly his ideas were taken seriously and became much more mainstream. And this picture, he's been photoshopped up as Erasmus, the Renaissance man. And he's described as the naissance man, naissance as in the birth of life. And you can see he's got his reactor. This was at JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. And behind a model of a bit of a lost city hydrothermal system. And to the right, you can see a section of one of these alkaline hydrothermal vents. And I said it looked a bit like a mineralized sponge, and now you can see this is an interconnected set of pores, interconnected pores. And Mike had described these as electrochemical flow reactors. We have effectively reactive hydrothermal fluids, ocean waters coming in. We have catalytic walls with iron and sulfur minerals in these walls, and a continual percolation and mixing of these fluids within the thing. And this is the setting that he has argued for 30 years now is where life originated. And for the last part of this lecture, I'm going to try and make this case.